totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Hey guys, welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Find the show wherever you get your favorite podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Apple, YouTube Music, and more. Also catch every episode on video on YouTube at Booked on Rock. We're talking Paul McCartney this episode, specifically his music during the decade of the 90s. Author J.R. Moores has a new book out now titled Off the Ground, Paul McCartney in the 1990s. This was an era like no other for McCartney, perhaps even the most significant decade of his entire career after the 1960s. Following a shakier 1980s, the decade would see him reemerge with greater energy, momentum, and self-belief. J.R. Moore's sympathetic but not uncritical new book explores McCartney's 90s with its impressive studio and live albums, colossal tours, unexpected side projects, and imaginative collaborations, forays into classical composition, some new Beatles numbers, and a whole lot more besides. Moores reveals how McCartney's reputation began to be perceived more generously by the public, and he argues that his output and activities in the 90s would uncover more about the person behind them than in any other decade. A playlist of Paul McCartney in the 90s can be found in the show notes. Welcome, JR.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be on again.
Great to have you here. You say the 90s, a decade like no other for Paul. It could even be argued that this may have been the most significant decade of his entire career after the 60s. Talk about why you feel that way.
I guess what I'm trying to get at in the book a little bit is the way that Paul's reputation, I write at the beginning about how his reputation dips a little bit in the 80s. I mean, you know, relatively speaking, this is still Paul McCartney and an ex-Beatle we're talking about. But the book is about not just Paul McCartney and what he gets up to, but also about what's going on in the wider world, which affects Paul McCartney and what he's doing and his reputation and how he's perceived by both the public and the press. And I would say, if there was a time when Paul McCartney is at his least popular with the public and the press, then I would say that was the 1980s. And there are various reasons for that. It's not just Paul McCartney's fault for releasing Give My Regards to Broad Street or The Frog Chorus or whatever you want to attack him for in that decade. But firstly, of course, punk comes along, and I think particularly in England, maybe you can enlighten me on how that impacts in America. I think maybe people remain kinder to Paul McCartney in America in the aftermath of punk. I don't know, but in England certainly there are lots of punk bands who are either sincerely or not having a go at the older generation of rock stars, and particularly the Beatles. You've got the Clash singing about Beatlemania, phony Beatlemania having bitten the dust. The Sex Pistols slag off the Beatles as often as they can, really. And it's a generational thing of pop culture moving forward and rejecting what your parents liked and embracing the new. So that tarnishes the Beatles a little bit, and Paul McCartney as a surviving Beatle from the late 70s onwards. Then you have John Lennon dying, obviously, and he is martyred, if you want to call it. And that means that people talk about John Lennon in very respectful, revering terms because of the nature of his death for quite a long time afterwards. And quite often people talk about Paul McCartney in the same breath in negative terms. So people will talk about how great John Lennon was, and they will also talk about how naff Paul McCartney was/is. There are even like obituaries or think pieces written after, like very soon after John Lennon's death, where rock writers literally saying why wasn't Paul McCartney shot instead of John Lennon, which is so insensitive to everybody involved. I think Martin Amis wrote something for The Observer about, he's talking about John Lennon, how important he was, and then he goes off on one talking about Paul McCartney writing songs that your granny likes and that kind of thing. And it creates this narrative of Paul McCartney being the sort of safe, naff, cheesy, ballad writing, cute Beatle, and John Lennon being the edgy, experimental, politically radical Beatle. And that's true to a certain extent, but it's also in other ways a bit of a myth. And Paul McCartney, I think personally, obviously personally disagrees with that narrative that gets set in stone, if you like, during the 1980s. But he doesn't push back very much or very often against it, probably out of respect for his dead bandmate and friend. And in the 90s, there are various things. One thing that happens is that he does start to push back against that narrative a little bit by reasserting his reputation and his role in the Beatles and the kind of radical things that he did with them.
I think here in the States, the view of Paul, well, here in general in the States, and I'm assuming it's the same in the UK, but you could speak to this. But when John passed away, just like a lot of these artists, when they pass away, they are elevated to this status that no living person can match, right? That's why we see when with the numbers of sales and interest in these artists after they die. So Paul was up against that, but in the 70s, he's really trying to distance himself from Paul the Beatle. So he's trying to work on that. And then when John's assassinated, he spends the 80s now having to be put in that place where we can't take Paul as seriously as John. I mean, John Lennon was John Lennon. I mean, he was, nobody like him. So he was kind of up against that decade. So I see where you go with this book and the idea that in the 90s, enough time has gone by now where he's starting to speak his mind a little bit more, and he's starting to really be more of just Paul McCartney, the individual person and artist, maybe more than any other decade. And that is interesting to look at it that way.
Exactly, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. As you say, John Lennon has that elevated status almost all the way through the 80s, really, and there's literature that feeds into that as well. Philip Norman's Shout, which is about the Beatles, is openly pro-Lennon and anti-McCartney, and it's only towards the end of the 80s, I think, when people start to get a bit more cynical towards that narrative, or start to discuss some of the more negative personality traits that John Lennon had more widely. That kind of balances things back again. It makes Lennon more of a human being, I suppose, and not a saintly figure, which he would have objected to most of the time anyway. And in terms of Paul, as you say, he does start to reassert himself. He's not biting his tongue so much. There's one of the tour programs, because he starts to tour again as well. That's another thing. He's not playing live during the 80s, so he's back on the road playing some Beatles songs live that have never been performed live by him before, which is a big boost. Obviously, in one of the tour programs, there's a little article about it where he discusses his experimental tendencies in the Beatles, the experimental artists and writers he was hanging out with in the 60s, William Burroughs, etc., Ginsberg, people like that. And that's then elaborated on in much greater detail in the Barry Miles Many Years From Now biography, which McCartney is very heavily involved with. A lot of that is about how Paul came up with the idea of tape loops for Tomorrow Never Knows, was pushing the orchestra in The Day of the Life, and he does finally kind of go, look, I was the experimental one, or I was at least one of the experimental ones in the Beatles. I wasn't just doing the balance.
Interesting, though, like biographers like Chet Flippo, ready to write him off by the end of the decade. You talk about that in the book, but he did end the 80s pretty well. I mean, he had Flowers in the Dirt, which I think the album itself hit #1. And then My Brave Face was a top 20 single. That's the one Elvis Costello wrote or co-wrote with Paul. So he's doing well with that. But still, people are ready to write him off. But in 1993, he comes in with the next studio album, which is Off the Ground. The feet that we see hanging at the top of the album cover, those are of his new touring band. He had, as you say, he returned to touring by the end of the 80s. Talk about how important that was for him as far as what we're going to hear from him in the 90s. And by the way, which pair are Paul's feet?
There's a picture of that cover in the book, yeah, and the little caption beneath is kind of matched the feet of the band member. Yeah, I think maybe one of the reasons he doesn't tour in the 80s, apart from raising his kids, etc., is that maybe he's frightened of a fan murdering him like Lennon was murdered, and maybe doesn't want to risk being in front of that many people. But he gets over that, starts touring again in sort of 89, 90. And yeah, as I say, as well as playing solo material, he's playing Beatles songs that were never performed by the Beatles because they obviously stopped touring themselves after a while because they couldn't hear themselves over the screams of their fans and concentrated on studio work. So that's very exciting for Beatles fans, and that boosts his profile, if you like, and it's a very successful tour. In terms of that impacting on the Off the Ground album, the previous two albums, as you say, they're successful to a certain degree, but the reviews are pretty mixed, and you get the feeling now that Paul McCartney felt that he was kind of working with too many producers and too many computers and overthinking everything, and a case of kind of too many cooks spoiling the broth musically. And he decides to just do the next album Off the Ground with the band that he's been playing with live and enjoying playing with live. And it's much more organic and earthy and not very precious. They do as few takes as possible. And it's a way of working that reminds him of the early Beatles days where they would go into the studio with George Martin and maybe do like 3 amazing Beatles songs in one day and lay them down, and those were the official releases. So he's a bit more relaxed, I think, and less worried about having a hit, possibly, and maybe having more fun in the studio that he's had previously. And that you can feel that in the album, that it's you know, I won't say it's his best solo album or anything like that, but there's an atmosphere to it where you can tell he's letting his hair down and he's having fun and he's rocking out with other musicians again.
Biker Like an Icon is a key track to that point, because you say that was first take recording.
Yeah, and he doesn't mind there being mistakes in it. It's, you know, it's got that sort of spontaneity to it, if you like, that obviously inspires him or stimulates his mind somehow.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
We will now pause for station identification. This is NUTS.
Maybe this is the hot take, because I said this before we started recording. I like this album more than Flaming Pie. There you have it. I love the title track.
Yeah.
I think it's a great song.
Probably in the minority there. I do prefer Flaming Pie.
I'm not surprised. It did very well with critics and fans. I don't know. I seem to like it's the title track in particular I really like, but Hope and Deliverance, good song. Come On People, I like. Well, I did find a photo, so I think Paul's feet are third from the left. I don't know if we could see.
Okay.
It's kind of bright, but you could Google online. Oh, this is really terrible. It's not. Oh, there we go. I think you can see that.
Right. Yeah, brilliant.
There's Paul. It's blurry, but you get the picture.
Yeah.
That's Linda. So Linda's second from the left, Paul's third from the left. That's the answer to the question we've all been.
The other thing I should say about Off the Ground is that, like, I have this thing going through the book where in the 90s, I feel like in some ways Paul is caring less than ever before, but that's also sort of balanced with, in other ways, he's caring more. And that sort of dichotomy is important in the 90s, I think. So in off the Ground, as I say, it's very relaxed, carefree, first take kind of attitude. At the same time, he wants his lyrics to be sort of very good. So he gets the poet Adrian Mitchell to kind of vet his lyrics like an English teacher would in class, to make sure they're, as he calls them, poet proof. Because I guess some critics have mocked his lyrics in the past as being kind of banal or nonsensical or whatever. So I think that's interesting as well, this kind of caring less in one sense and caring more in another sense, and that kind of comes together to kind of make it quite an interesting decade for him, and that continues into Flaming Pie as well. As I say, I do prefer Flaming Pie, unlike you, but I think Off the Ground makes a better book title because it feeds into this kind of story of the 80s being a bit of a dip and then the 90s being a rise again. So
yeah, it is a perfect album title to use for the book. And as we know, 1993, we're at the height of the grunge era, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, and Pearl Jam, and all these bands. It's an angrier, darker time in rock history. That's reflected in the lyrics on Off the Ground. It's in there, yet Paul's on stage persona is still the same sunny, happy Paul of old.
Yeah.
And that could have been considered uncool, and it was, I guess, at one point, but he seemed to be winning people over with that persona. Do you think maybe fans needed that bit of sunshine amidst the darkness of the early 90s?
That's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, I suppose if something becomes quite so dominant in the culture, then people are going to want a sort of antidote or a break from that. Off the ground, kind of, because it is sort of organic and raw and live in the studio, in that sense, that is kind of in tune with grunge, if you like. Though it's far from a grunge album, as you would agree.
But it is heavier, though. It's got a heavy. The drums are really heavy.
Yeah,
almost like a guy that he would work with many years later, Dave Grohl. You know.
Sure, yeah, and there are some dark lyrics in there. There's one or two. One's got a sort of stalker narrative going on, it seems.
That's a misunderstanding with Paul, because he does have a little bit of a darker side to him.
True.
He does have, and Linda McCartney once said he's got a bit of a temper.
Yeah.
But I think everybody always looked at him, especially when you put him against John, then maybe he was always sunny and upbeat and happy. But
people always mean about Maxwell Silver Hammer, but it's about a hammer wielding serial killer, so it's pretty edgy in that respect.
And ask Paul to talk about Michael Jackson. He wasn't happy about that. But he still handled that so well whenever he talks about it in public.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean he's real, he's got emotions.
Yeah. And I think it's quite interesting that you've brought grunge up, and I think it is interesting. Later he plays with Dave Grohl, as you're saying, that kind of thing. Another thing that happens in the 90s is we have the Britpop explosion here in the UK. So bands like Oasis, who are massive from about 1994, 1995, and get compared to the Beatles, and they go on about the Beatles on and that helps to make the Beatles cool again. But Paul McCartney kind of keeps his distance from it, which is interesting. Perhaps, I think, because he knows it's going to be a sort of flash in the pan kind of momentary explosion before fading again, which is what happens.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was smart on his part.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially because it is also associated with sort of flag waving nationalism and laddie kind of. There's a sort of misogynist element to it as well. So, and there's an interview on a British television program called TFI Friday. Are you familiar with that program? So it's a sort of chat show, pop culture kind of television show. A bit, let's say a bit like David Letterman kind of thing, but a bit more scrappier, maybe a bit less slick. Presented by this guy called Chris Evans, and Paul McCartney appears on that when he's promoting Flaming Pie. So that's 1997, and the host Chris Evans asks Paul McCartney which sort of modern new bands he's been listening to recently. And Paul McCartney says Nirvana, right? So this is 3 years after Kurt Cobain has died, and he's still saying Nirvana as a kind of new band that he's listening to. Now, you could say that shows that he's out of touch already by that time, but I also wonder whether he feels a greater affinity to the kind of grunge movement than he does to the Britpop movement, which is kind of certainly in Britain kind of displaced the grunge popularity, if you like.
He always kept an eye on the charts, at least I know in the 80s, 70s and 80s. He was always keeping a keen eye on the charts, not so much just to say, let me have bigger hits than them, but he was just kind of looking to see what kind of instruments are being used, how they're produced, anything that's different in there that maybe he can, or the beats, drum loops.
Yeah, and he still does that today,
Right.
He's on the
Which that's my point. See, I don't.
Octogenarian. He's on the pulse of what is big, definitely.
So I don't think he was behind the times in '97. That's just my opinion. I just think that's just what he said. I mean,
I think probably it's to do with not wanting to be too closely associated with Britpop, and I think maybe he saw something similar in Kurt Cobain to John Lennon as well. There's similar personas, similar backgrounds, if you like, to a certain extent. Similar sounding voice to a degree as well. So I think maybe that's involved perhaps as well. And his son James McCartney was a Nirvana fan as well. So I think that's
I remember David Frick from Rolling Stone when Kurt Cobain died. He said, "I don't think people understand how many similarities Kurt had to John Lennon." which he did. Yeah, then the Beatles. So while Paul's continuing with his solo career, it's important to talk about his place in Beatles history during this decade. This is a quote from your book. At this point, he was, quote, feeling less like he was stepping on other people's toes or causing unnecessary upset to John Lennon fanatics by taking spiritual ownership of old Beatles hits and countering what he considered to be misleading portrayals of the past. So if you could talk about that and how he viewed the Beatles at this point, his place in Beatles history, his place in Beatles history in comparison to John, with now over a decade has passed since John's death.
Yeah, I think he feels that there is enough time past now that he can stop biting his tongue and can be a bit more forthright in challenging this narrative that has been built up that John is edgy and experimental and radical and etc. etc. And Paul McCartney is safe and saccharine and writes ballads and granny music and that kind of thing, which he does do, but he also was very heavily involved in pushing the Beatles to the limits of where they got to, and it becomes very clear in Barry Miles's Many Years From Now that is what he wants to project. And you could, if you want to be cynical about it, you could say it's just Paul McCartney, being self-serving or that kind of thing. But I do think it stands up. He was hanging around with experimental writers and artists at a point in the 60s where John Lennon was living in the suburbs with Cynthia and watching too much television and not having a very nice time. I'm not saying John Lennon wasn't experimental at all, but Paul McCartney was messing around with tape loops. He was, coming up with a concept album for Sgt. Pepper's. He was working with George Martin to experiment sonically. Yeah, and in the 90s, he's happier than he was before to make that clear.
From reading the book, the Gallagher brothers, going back to Oasis, Gallagher brothers it seems like they were less fans of the Beatles' work and more fans of their popularity, but then they changed that opinion because they were taking so much criticism or heat for saying they were better than the Beatles.
Yeah, it's another thing that Paul sort of observes as well. He says at one point, by all means be bigger than the Beatles or aim to be bigger than the Beatles, but don't say it. Don't say it out loud, because as soon as you've said it, the cat's out of the bag and it's just going to not work out well, and it doesn't work out particularly well for Oasis. There's a famous article, I forget the writer.
What was the article regarding?
It's a headline for an article, and it calls the Oasis the Sex Beatles, right? So it's like this combination of the Sex Pistols and the Beatles making Oasis. And I suppose the Sex Pistols element is Liam Gallagher's quite sort of snary vocal style, and the Beatles element is more to do with the sort of melody and the things that Noel Gallagher is writing. And the more that journalists mention the Beatles, the more Oasis mention the Beatles as well, and this kind of perpetuates. So eventually Liam Gallagher is calling his firstborn son Lennon Gallagher and that kind of thing, and he starts dressing more like John Lennon as well, and it becomes this kind of obsession. But I do question in the book whether that obsession was there in the Gallaghers' early lives, and there were various bits of evidence you could kind of pick that go, actually, they weren't these massive Beatles nuts until the ball was rolling and everyone was comparing them to the Beatles, and they kept mentioning the Beatles. And as you say, they have this ambition and this arrogance, if you like, Oasis, to be the biggest band since the Beatles, the biggest British band since the Beatles. And for a while, they do very well over here, particularly, but then it kind of, after about 1997, it falls off, doesn't it? And they fail to break America, it seems, and they're certainly don't have the global impact anywhere near the Beatles, and they don't have the musical ambition either, because they don't push themselves in the way the Beatles push themselves.
Yeah, not even close. Not even close. I'm a fan of those Oasis albums, but yeah, is it Cliff Jones?
Cliff Jones, that's it.
The Face. The Face was the magazine, I think.
Cliff Jones and the Face, that's right.
Never mind the bollocks. Here's the Sex Beatles. That's the headline.
Yeah.
So what about George Martin's son, Giles, who he was quoted in the book saying the success of Oasis re-legitimized Beatles fandom and introduced them to a new generation. He says that upset people.
Yeah, of course it helps that there's like Oasis are really popular for a while and the coolest band in the country, if you like. And so they're going on about the Beatles. Journalists are comparing them to the Beatles. So young kids reading about them, watching their interviews, etc., go and they think, well, let's check out the Beatles then if they weren't familiar with them before, or check them out again if they thought, oh, that's my parents' music and I'm not interested. So that they go and they check out the Beatles and they realise, oh, the Beatles are loads better than Oasis, so maybe we don't need Oasis anymore. I don't want to be slagging off Oasis all the time, but I do like the first Oasis album. And
yeah, I'm a fan. You sure? Sure.
But it's interesting.
I think in their defense too, the media, once they started saying those things and then the media would take off with it, it took on it became this monster that was created based on combination of what they were saying and then the media really blowing it up. So it is what it is, but
they've scuppered me slightly by announcing these reunion shows for this year, finally, after patching things up.
Yep.
Because I do say that in the book that the Beatles cross the generations very easily, whereas Oasis are very much of their moment. But now 18-year-olds are buying tickets to see Oasis this year, so I don't know whether that stands up. But
hey, nothing wrong with that.
Those 18-year-olds might realise how boring Oasis were and are live.
Yeah. Hey, look, I always say now though, these days, if an 18-year-old's going to a rock and roll show, great, that's good. I'll take it because I don't know what's going on with the rock and roll. There's still so many great bands out there. It's just they're just not as known as some of the other artists that are right now. Country and rap are the big forms. I mean, pop is always going to be huge.
Country's got really big over here, which certainly wasn't the case in the olden days. So we have like massive festivals in huge stadiums where all the country stars come over and play their tunes and sell their wares and everything, and it's a
big money maker. Beyonce even put out a country album, and
true.
Post Malone put out a country album. So
Ringo Starr's latest album is country.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I've seen the future. You know what it is? It's a 47-year-old virgin sitting around in his beige pajamas, drinking a banana broccoli shake, singing I'm an Oscar Mayer wiener.
That Beatles anthology series, I figured that, especially as I started reading the book, I thought, well, I know where this is going. That they capitalize on the timing of the success of Britpop in the 90s, but that wasn't the case because this was planned prior to all of this, according to the book. As you write, quote, "This was not some cynical attempt to capitalize on the country's moment of renewed coolness. It was more a happy coincidence for the Beatles brand." How did that project come about?
As Britpop is booming, you also get the Beatles anthology, which is documentary series as well as a set of 3 compilation albums, double CD sets, if you like. And it wasn't cynical timing. They didn't go, Oasis are going on about the Beatles, let's quickly cobble together this anthology. It's kind of, in a way, it's in the works, like from the final days of the Beatles and when they're splitting, because Neil Aspinall who's part of Apple, wants to make a documentary about their career and does kind of put something together, but it doesn't get released. And there's various things that prevent that, which includes the Beatles having all fallen out with each other and their different management having fallen out with each other and wrestling over song rights and royalties, etc., etc. But by the 90s, they've kind of come to an agreement and sorted those problems out. George Harrison, who's resistant at first to the idea of a Beatles anthology, he comes round because his Handmade Films company goes bankrupt. I think he loses a lot of money. So he's kind of keener to be involved again for material reasons, anti-material George, but yes. And so it all comes together and then they work on this documentary series, and George Martin puts a lot of work into the compilation albums, and that happens to coincide with the rise of Britpop in 1995. So again, firstly, it helps older fans sort of rediscover the Beatles, if you like, because there are these the anthology albums have outtakes and stuff and Beatles material that hasn't been heard before. That's quite exciting. And again, young people go out and buy them as well and discover what was so great about the Beatles and realise that some of the current bands that are influenced by the Beatles are not quite as adept as the Beatles were at art. And the documentary series as well, it's a sort of, it's an official version of a story, and it's sugar coated in a certain sense, but it also has sort of revealing things about the different members and the Beatles' career, and it all helps to boost the Beatles brand, if you like, in the 90s. And it proves a great success as well.
The two songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love. So those were from tapes that John had. Free as a Bird, I think, was dated back to the 70s, and Real Love would have been around 79 or 80. How did those come about? Because Paul gets together with George and Ringo to put these together and put them out as singles.
So they're sort of working more easily with Yoko Ono as well, and the John Lennon estate. And there were these demo tapes that Yoko has in her possession of just sort of songs that John had been working on privately at home, not great recordings or anything, demos basically. And during the anthology, the process, they think, what would it be like to make music together again? And Yoko offers these demos to them, and they sort of rifle through them and pick out a couple of numbers that they think they could turn into more fully formed tracks. And they try to imagine John being with them there, or John Lennon's given them this song and then gone on holiday or popped to the shops, and they'll finish it off for him in his absence. And Free as a Bird goes to number one. Oh, is it number two? It's number two. Is it number two?
I'll check. I'll look that up.
I've forgotten.
Real Love might have been. I think, wasn't Real Love the first release?
I think Free as a Bird was first.
Okay.
One of them's kept off the top spot by Michael Jackson's Earth song, which must have really annoyed Paul McCartney.
Oh, man. Yeah, I remember that.
Because he owned the rights to the Beatles songs for a little while.
Let's see. Free as a Bird. I like both the songs. I know they're more, they do sound a little Traveling Wilbury-ish because Jeff Lynne produced them.
Yeah.
Song peaked at number 2 in the UK, number 6 in the US. Free as a Bird. So let's see how Real Love did. And that was 95. 96, Real Love came out. Number 4 in the UK, 11 in the US.
Right.
So I guess, was that a disappointment? Were they expecting 2 number 1 singles, or did they not really concern themselves?
I think they probably were expecting 2 number 1 singles. I think George Martin, at the press conference when they announced that they're working on new stuff, says that it's going to be number 1 in everywhere around the world.
That's right. That's in the book.
I don't know. Would you expect them to go to number 1 around the world in 1995? I don't know, but
I would have. I know classic rock radio was huge in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
I think they're great songs. Are they on the level of the brilliant genius songs that they wrote while all 4 were alive? No, I don't think anybody, not even themselves, could recreate that, even if John was alive, because there's just that certain period of time that every artist has that they just are firing on all cylinders, and the songs that they wrote right up through the end before they broke up were just brilliant. Having said that, Free as a Bird and Real Love, I loved it. I'm a Traveling Wilburys fan. I'm a Jeff Lynne fan, so that contributes to why I loved them as well. What did you think of the songs when you first heard them? What do you think of them now?
I prefer Free as a Bird to Real Love. I do think they are a little bit too Jeff Lynne.
That's the criticism. Fair.
I think maybe if George Martin had done those ones, they might have sounded a little bit different. I think George Martin's hearing's starting to go a little bit by then, although he's involved in putting this compilation together. There is something in that, but also I think George Harrison might have insisted on Jeff Lynne producing because he's got a good relationship with Jeff Lynne, Traveling Wilburys, as you say, etc. Yeah, as you say, they're competing with their 60s selves is an impossible thing to top, really, isn't it? But I prefer them to Now and Then, which came out. When was that?
I was going to ask you about that. That was last year.
Last year, yeah. Which is a similar process, but this time AI was involved, I believe, in kind of cleaning up the John Lennon demo, which I think it does have a lovely melody to it, the little John Lennon main melody. But then again, they've sort of dressed it up into this kind of electric light orchestra, kind of George Martin-esque, but it's Giles Martin doing the orchestration this time. And I think that did go to number one, didn't it? But for me, it just felt a little bit synthetic, or a little bit Abbey Road by Numbers kind of feel to the song. And
I think it's a nice song, but yeah, it's not like you're gonna. I won't skip over it if it comes up on Spotify for me. Yeah. But it's not like I'm gonna go to that over again. I wouldn't go with that over Free as a Bird or Real Love.
No.
Chart performance. Now and Then debuted on the UK singles chart at on November 3rd at number 42, based on 10 hours of sales. But then the following week, rose 41 positions to number one.
Yeah,
their first UK number one in 54 years since The Ballad of John and Yoko in 1969. And then in the US, debuted at number one on the Billboard Digital Song Sales Chart for the week ending November 11, 2023. 17,000 downloads. There you go. Debuted at number 5 on the Billboard Bubbling Under Hot 100 chart. I don't know what the hell that means, but Now and Then debuted at number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100. But it did well.
You know, all that goes back to the anthology, really. You know, the anthology, as I say, it boosts the Beatles brand, and then you get all these extra things that come off of that, and continuing to, you know, there's the number one compilation album and the Cirque du Soleil remix thing, and then all the deluxe expanded editions of everything that comes out. And it's, I guess you could say that would have happened anyway, but it's certainly... To
me, it's icing on the cake. I guess I'm looking at it that way, to be a positive Paul McCartney-like person here. But yeah, it's icing on the cake. It's like, if you don't want it, that's cool. But it's there. If you want to listen to it, it's cool. You're always going to have the original work. So this is just something extra they're going to offer up to you if you want it. I look at it that way.
That's a good attitude to take.
There you go. Right.
There's a bit of I go on a bit of a rant about box sets at some point in the book, and certain critics, he's saying these are, you know, pointless things. They include takes that the artist rejected and didn't want you to hear. And as you say, I think that it's good that they're out there. You know, why should these just be in the possession of the archivists at Abbey Road or whatever? It's good that they're in public domain.
Nobody's forcing you to buy it.
No one's forcing you to buy it. You can listen to it if you want. You can get something out of that. It's good for research purposes. It's good to know about musicians' processes, etc. And if you don't want to listen to it, you don't have to. But as you say, it's good that it's there.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Hold on.
Let's go to Flaming Pie now, 1997. That's his 10th solo studio album. It reached number 2 on Billboard, 15 slots higher than Off the Ground. Young Boy, Beautiful Night, released as singles in the UK. The World Tonight, released as a single in the US. Proved to be one of his most critically acclaimed albums from any decade. And then you write that it was assumed that revisiting the old days when working on the anthology had rekindled his greatness. How much did the anthology and Paul revisiting his Beatles roots influence this album? Because it definitely influenced the album title, right?
Yes, it did. So the title comes from a quip by John Lennon about where the Beatles name came from. And he says, in his sort of slightly surreal way, it came to me on a flaming pie in a dream or something. So the title does hark back to the Beatles. A lot of the sort of promo relates to the anthology as well, and Paul kind of getting his mojo back, having spent some time talking about the Beatles and thinking about the Beatles, etc. But on the other hand, I sort of think that's in a way a sort of press speak, really, because some of the tracks date quite far back before the anthology project. You know, some of them he was writing during Off the Ground, but they didn't quite fit on that album, so he's brought them in for this one. You know, he's Paul McCartney. He's always making music, so it's not like he's suddenly did the Beatles anthology and then thought, oh, maybe I should make an album. You know, he's making music all the time, and eventually there's an album and he puts it out. In a way, the Beatles anthology delayed Flaming Pie because he was told not to release any solo albums during the anthology campaign because it would interfere with that. And I suppose record companies didn't want Paul McCartney competing with young Paul McCartney. Again, in a way, it comes from the momentum that he discovered during Off the Ground. And although he's not working with the touring band again, he's working quite quickly and unpreciously and fairly organically and in a raw sort of way, again, if you like. But again, talking about the kind of not caring and caring dichotomy, he wants there to be no filler on it. He chooses very carefully what songs should go on there, and he wants it to be kind of banger after banger, if you like. Whether he succeeds in that task is up to the listener, and I would say it isn't a perfect album, but it's certainly one of his most warmly received solo albums since Wings. And again, people would be listening to it in 1997 and thinking, well, these melodies are nicer than what Noel Gallagher or Travis are coming up with. And so that's a really important album for him as well.
And then the next year, sadly, Linda McCartney passes away. April of 1998 had to have been devastating for Paul. They married in 1969. They seemed like the perfect couple. She was a big part of his solo career. In fact, you write in the book, Linda McCartney played a greater role in her husband's music than has been recognized or appreciated. It may certainly have been subtle, yet it was not insignificant, nor was it identifiably off-the-ground detrimental.
So there's a whole chapter on Linda in the book, which some people might find surprising. I don't know. But yeah, there are a few reasons why she was so important. I mean, obviously, she had his back all the time. She was really supportive. She rescued him from despair, if you like, when the Beatles had split and he was moping around unshaven, not getting out of bed, not knowing what to do with himself. She has a very successful 90s in her own right with a vegetarian cookbooks and campaigns and food range. So there's that going on. Yeah, if I did ever get to speak to Paul McCartney, I would love to ask him about Linda's musicianship and what she was bringing to Wings and all the solo albums that she appeared on. Obviously, she's a non-musician who gets kind of thrust into the spotlight, which she's not particularly comfortable with. She's a photographer by trade, so she's naturally happier behind the camera than in front of it, I think.
Yeah, she had to learn on the job when she joined his band.
Yeah, I think with Paul McCartney, there's a through line where he doesn't like music that gets too complicated or too flash or too show-offy, which again, maybe that links to, well, maybe you could make links to grunge as well in that sense. But in the Beatles days, he'd fall out with George Harrison because George Harrison was doing a solo that was too diddly widdly, and he'd rein him in, and George would get cross about that. There's a point where he says he doesn't want Wings to turn into Pink Floyd. So again, you could say he wants to keep things more simple and less histrionic, if you like, than Pink Floyd. He never learns to read music because he thinks that will ruin some of the magic of music making. So he can't actually read notation. And I just wonder whether having Linda, the non-musician in the band, as well as being there all the time and being supportive and being together, etc., I just wonder whether there's a sort of primitiveness or amateurishness that Paul really relishes and bounces off as well. And I would love to ask him about that. I was watching the One Hand Clapping Wings film recently. It's come out after my book's published. Linda's keyboard work on that is phenomenal. The sounds that she's getting out of her instruments and her Moogs or whatever she's using, it really adds to the sound, and it's really quite sort of noticeable and enjoyable. And I loved watching that.
Yeah. Paul was known as an upbeat, happy guy. We mentioned that, but he got frustrated with the narrative that he was, quote, the writer of, insubstantial melodic pop music as opposed to John Lennon, who was thought to be, among other laudable things, the bold and uncompromising experimentalist. And we did touch on this earlier, but there were some off-the-record comments that Paul made in 1981 about this, and you include in the book.
Yeah, there's a phone call he makes to Hunter Davis, which he doesn't think is being recorded or written down, where he has a little bit of a rant about the St. John figure and the way the Beatles story is being told. And at some point, Hunter Davis includes that in a reprint of his Beatles biography, which is a bit unfair because McCartney did think it was off the record.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Off the record is off the record.
Yeah.
But if you're as a journalist, if somebody says this is off the record and you publish it,
yeah, it's not good, is it? So that kind of doesn't paint him in a particularly good light, I suppose.
And I don't know if I'm an artist, I want to talk to that journalist in the future because I'm afraid that might say something that would end up being published.
Yeah, you've got to be careful when you talk to journalists. But if you say something's off the record, as you say, then it's the record. That's sort of ethics. So you can tell that is there in Paul's mind all the time. But as I say, it's not until the late 80s and the 90s where he starts to, on the record, push back a little bit against how he feels he's been unfairly portrayed by various journalists and writers and other people.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Would you mind? I won't be long.
How about Paul, the classical composer? That's what we get in the 90s. That's another side of Paul that we get during that decade. Talk about those projects and how were they received by critics and fans? There were three altogether he released. 3 that decade, not just one.
Yes, it's a really busy decade, and I don't even cover everything that he got up to in the whole of the book. But so he's not just doing tours and studio albums in the sort of classic McCartney sense, but he's also dabbling in classical composition, which he needs help with because, as I said before, he can't read music and he can't notate. So it's collaborative in a sense. It's more successful commercially because it's got the name Paul McCartney involved than it is critically, perhaps also because it's got Paul McCartney involved. And maybe I'm not a classical music person, I'm a classical music buff, and I'm certainly not a classical music critic. And perhaps some critics objected just to the classical work because he was kind of known for being part of the pop world and he was sort of imposing himself into there.
But classical music was infused into Beatles music.
True.
It's not like he was completely foreign to it.
That's absolutely right, yeah. There's maybe something to be said about the class system over here and the fact that classical music became something that the elites would listen to, and Paul McCartney, as a working class person from the lower brow pop world, suddenly chancing his arm at classical, was kind of sneered at, if you like.
How dare you?
Yeah, yeah.
Right, I can see how they could look at it that way. Somebody like myself looks at it as like, so hey, give it a shot, see what happens.
Yeah.
But that's my mindset is like, just, if it falls flat, it falls flat. But if he wants to do it.
One of them is titled Working Classical, so that is a loaded term that he uses very much on purpose. So I find it hard to judge how successful or not his classical compositions are because, I'm more of a rock guy, if you like.
Yeah, same here. I haven't even heard any of it. I wouldn't even know. I'll give it a listen, but again, I'm all for an artist doing whatever they feel they want to do. I'll tell you the one project that I really enjoy, and it's one that was experimental for him, is the Fireman project. One of my favorite Paul McCartney songs is Sing the Changes. That's from 2008. That was their third album, Electric Arguments. The first two came out in the 90s. This is, I guess, an EDM, ambient kind of industrial sound, but it's so far removed from Paul's solo work and the Beatles. Fascinating to me. It may be the most experimental of all of his 90s projects. What are the origins of Fireman? It's just him and one other guy.
Yeah, so as well as sort of reasserting his role as experimental in the Beatles, he also starts making some of the most experimental music he ever has, which is with the Fireman. So that is with the guy Youth from Killing Joke, who's also a producer for lots of different acts and was involved in the orb and stuff, in sort of dub and techno. The origins of that you can date back to Off the Ground as well. So although Off the Ground is, as I said, a very earthy, raw, live sounding album, he's also commissions Youth and other people to do remixes of the tracks for like 12-inch single releases. So Youth starts working on those, and I think the stipulation is that he's only allowed to use music that Paul McCartney has made in making these remixes, so he can't add anything else or anything from any other artist. Can't throw in a James Brown sample like everybody likes to do. But that kind of, he has so much fun making that it kind of escalates into a whole album's worth of material. And Paul enjoys it as well, so he starts sort of tinkering alongside Youth, and they come up with the debut Fireman album, which originally they tried to release kind of under the radar without anyone knowing that it's Paul McCartney and Youth. It's just this new artist, the Fireman, but I guess it's hard if you're Paul McCartney.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, keep things under wraps, so fairly quickly people do know who's involved. And then with the second album, that is sort of a full-bore collaboration between the two individuals from the off, and they know they're making an album together. Rushes, it's called, and that for me is one of the most interesting records that Paul McCartney releases in the 1990s, because it is quite so ambient and abstract and sort of chill out room dance hall vibes.
Well, the third one I know from what I read was Paul didn't even have any lyrics. He just said, let's play something and I'll just come up with the lyrics. Is that what he did on the previous two?
Well, there isn't much singing on the first two.
Okay.
The third one has much more vocals on it. With the other ones, it's kind of like if there are vocals, they're kind of floating very deeply in the mix.
Oh, so it's an added instrument more than lyrics.
Yeah.
Well, I know Killing Joke from Nirvana history. You know this? Killing Joke, their song 80s.
Yeah.
There was a plagiarism case, Come As You Are, from Nirvana. That riff was allegedly taken from the Killing Joke song 80s. So that's when I read the book and I saw Killing Joke. I knew Killing Joke. I didn't know the artist himself that was part of it and worked with Paul.
Yeah, so that ties in with grunge as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. Didn't they I can't remember quite the details, but I think
they settled.
Is it Come As You Are? Is
Come As You Are, yeah. I think they may have settled, but
it
just looking at it,
the riff.
Accused of plagiarism, but I don't know. I could read the article here, but I think they settled. Avoiding legal issues, they decided against taking it any further. Killing Joke bassist said, yeah, Dave Grohl and I had a few laughs about that over the past year or so. He mentioned it to me when I met him backstage at Pantera a couple of years back. Not filing a lawsuit would be a blessing in disguise for Killing Joke, as the nicest man in rock and roll, Dave Grohl, would go out of his way to thank them for not potentially sabotaging Nirvana's career when they easily could have. So I guess they did not file a lawsuit. Another reason, potential reason as to why the band avoided a legal battle is because their song 80s itself had a striking resemblance to the Damned song from 1982, Life Goes On. Okay, so they...
All right.
Last question for you here, JR. Paul finished out the decade with 1999's Run Devil Run, mostly covers of both familiar and obscure 50s rock and roll songs, and then 3 original tracks. You read about this one, quote, Run Devil Run saw McCartney ground himself again, not only after the passing of his wife, but following the most remarkable and active decade he'd had since the 1960s. What are your thoughts on that album, finishing out the decade for Paul? Is he just looking to kind of go back to his roots there for it, or was that again something inspired by revisiting the Beatles' roots?
I think it's a sort of cathartic album for him. It's, as you say, Linda died, and in a sense, that Fireman album Rushes as a tribute to Linda, because it has samples from her pets, her horses, and it's got various different references to her floating in that mix. Although, it's, as I say, it's abstract, so it's not very kind of upfront tribute to Linda McCartney. But Youth has said it is a tribute to her, and it's one of the most important records that he's worked on. I think you could say that Run Devil Run is Paul McCartney going back to the music that he found solace in as a teenager after his mother died. She died very young of breast cancer, just as Linda did as well. So I think there's a kind of parallel thing going on there where he's cocooning himself a little bit with the music that he found solace in during that tragic time in his youth, and then kind of revisiting it during the tragic time he's having as an adult. And again, it's a sort of cathartic thing because it's again more so than Off the Ground, if you like. It's a very live sounding, raw rock and roll record with, you know, a couple of original songs in that style thrown in there as well. Interestingly, Dave Gilmour from Pink Floyd is involved in that one, but not sounding very Pink Floydy at all.
Yeah, he's on No More Lonely Nights.
Oh, he is, yeah.
One of my favorite Paul songs.
Yeah, but with Run Devil Run, they're kind of all playing this quite sort of ramshackle cavern club kind of way. So again, it's kind of think it's based in the past, but I think Paul McCartney isn't one to sort of wallow in the past ever, or for very long at least, and it's probably also part of his process of moving forward, which he continually does, always focused on the future more so than the past, I would argue.
And he does go into the 2000s, continuing to this day, still going.
No slowing down.
Nope. Off the Ground, Paul McCartney in the 1990s. It's out now. Find it wherever books are sold and look for it in your local bookstore if you have one. And if you're not sure if you have a local bookstore, you can go to bookedonrock.com and search for one there. And if they don't have this book in your bookstore, make sure they have it there. And where can people find you online, JR?
You can find me at, well, I don't know if you should still find me on Twitter, but I am on Twitter. I'm also on Blue Sky now.
I've set up an account there. I got to do more with it.
Yeah, it's where certain people are fleeing to. At Spinal Bap, you can find me on those social media platforms and on Instagram as well. And my writing is featured regularly at the Quietus website and in Record Collector magazine, sometimes The Wire and Bandcamp Daily and other places. Not so much Paul McCartney based necessarily, but maybe more in the vein of my previous book, Electric Wizards, A Tapestry of Heavy Music.
That was the first time you were on? Yeah, we had you on for that.
Right. Yeah. Which has some Paul McCartney content in there as well.
It does.
Early on, yeah.
It does. That's a fascinating book as well, so people can look for that.
Thank you.
Those books are on Amazon, so both books, you can find them there. So, JR, thanks so much for coming back on, and we look forward to having you back on again in the future, and thanks for roughing it out. You're a little under the weather, but you got through it.
Thanks. Yeah. Edit out any coughing that was going on, or I'm sorry. I apologize for that. But
yes, anybody who's listened to this saying, I didn't hear any coughs. He sounded fine. We did a little editing. The Beatles had to edit some of their songs. Yeah. Some of it ends up on the cutting room floor, which will happen here. But yeah, I appreciate it, JR. Thanks so much, and all the best with the book. Congrats. It's a great book.
Thank you.
That's it. It's in the books.